Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a review of the Plantagenet and Tudor Court series by Philippa Gregory. So I've done one other series review on this channel, and that was for the Whispers on the Moors trilogy by Sarah E. Ladd. But I said I want to do a full review of a series whenever I finish it, mostly for adult series, maybe some YA series. And I recently finished the Plantagenet and Tudor Court series by Philippa Gregory, which is a 15-book series. So we're going to look at the whole series. I'm going to go over the books in chronological order. I'm not covering release order because I have no idea what order they were released in. But I'm going to talk about them in the chronological order in which they take place. Then also the order that I read them, because it is nowhere near chronological order. And as I talk about them, I'll give you a general idea of what the books are about, and mostly who they follow and kind of the time period in which they took place. And then I'm going to rank the books, in my opinion, from the worst to the best, which is going to be interesting when there's 15 books. This video is going to take a while, I already know it is, so let's just go ahead and get started. Now, I did grab my books off the shelf that are from this series, but I only own 5 of the 15 books, so most of them I will have to have images up here on the screen. But before I start going over the individual books, I just want to let you know that there will be potentially what might feel like slight spoilers for later books in the series, as I have to kind of talk about this person is related to this person, because each book follows a different perspective. And so talking about who all the people are within each book might technically spoil something for a previous book, but it's a small part of it and it's part of history. You could find this out just by looking it up online. So I'm going to try to keep the spoilers at a minimum, but for some of the books, in order to talk about who the perspective character is and things like that, there might be some slight spoilers. So the first book chronologically is The Lady of the Rivers, and this one follows a woman named Jacquetta, who at the beginning of the book is married to the Duke of Bedford. And the Duke of Bedford at the time was residing in an area that is now France, and I can't remember the name of it. When I find it, I'll put it at the bottom of the screen. But he is serving over there. Today it's part of France, but at the time it was part of Britain's territory. And while she's there, she meets Joan of Arc, and she also gets recruited into doing some things that are more on the supernatural side, even though it's really considered illegal. I won't go into any more of her story than that, because again, spoilers, but these are things that come up early on in the book. The next book chronologically, and this gets iffy because if you go on Philippa Gregory's website, it's going to disagree with me. But the next book that I would recommend if you want to read chronologically is The White Queen. The website lists The Red Queen next, and I think for the most part the books are listed in chronological order based on the year in which the first chapter takes place. And in some cases you have the first chapter and then the next chapter jumps ahead 5 or 10 years. Or if you look at the rest of the book, chronologically speaking, it finishes after one of the books that it starts before. So I'm going to kind of put these in order that I think you should probably read them if you want to read in chronological order. So I would recommend The White Queen next. And this one follows the perspective of Elizabeth, who is the daughter of Jacquetta. And she marries a man named Edward, who becomes Edward IV. Again, like I said, it feels a little spoilery to say that because of things that happen in the book, but you need to know that he's Edward IV for later books in the series. So she is married to Edward IV, and it follows her perspective as he becomes Edward IV. The next book chronologically is The Red Queen, and this follows Margaret Beaufort, who is the mother of the man who would eventually become Henry VII. The next book would then be The Kingmaker's Daughter, which follows Anne Neville, I think is her last name, who becomes the wife of the man who will eventually be Richard III. We have a lot of eventuallys in these books, because a lot of times when they start, whatever title the person's going to have, they don't have it yet. But she is the wife of the man who will be Richard III. The next one after that is the first one that I own, and that is The White Princess. And this one follows Elizabeth, who is the daughter of Edward IV and Elizabeth. It gets confusing because a lot of people have a lot of the same names. But yes, there are 2 Elizabeths. This is the daughter of Edward IV. not the wife of Edward IV. And early on in the book, she also becomes the wife of Henry VII. Because in the Plantagenet part of the series, it's the time of the War of the Roses, which was the Lancasters versus the Yorks. And Elizabeth is a daughter of York. Henry VII is a son of Lancaster. So the two of them getting married was kind of a way of putting an end to the War of the Roses and uniting the two families. And then the next book chronologically, and mostly I put this one chronologically next because it is part of the Plantagenet part of the series. If you followed this series anywhere from early on in it, you will notice, like I did, that there used to be two series. There used to be the Tudor Court series, and there used to be the Cousins' War series, which is the War of the Roses, because the Yorks and the Lancasters are cousins. But when this next book I'm going to mention came out, all of a sudden the two series got merged because this next book's timeline crosses over with at least 3 books in the Tudor Court series. And so then they just merged the two series together for marketing purposes, I assume. So as far as when this one starts, it is definitely the next book chronologically, but it does cross over with at least the 3 books I'm going to talk about afterwards. So the next book is The King's Curse, and this one follows Margaret Pole, who is the cousin of Elizabeth from The White Princess. We do see a good part of her life in The White Princess, but this covers her later years, and it spans about 40 years, so that's why it crosses over with some other books in the series. The next book chronologically, sort of, thank you King's Curse for making this hard, is The Constant Princess. And this one follows the perspective of Catherine of Aragon, who we generally know to be the first wife of Henry VIII, but she was also married to Henry VII's oldest son, Arthur, until his death. So it follows through a good portion of her marriage to both of them. Not all of it, but a fair amount of it. The next one chronologically is what I consider to be kind of the oddball book in the series, and that is Three Sisters, Three Queens. This one follows the perspective of Margaret, who is the older sister of Henry VIII, and she was married to James IV of Scotland. The other 2 sisters are her younger sister Mary, and also Catherine of Aragon, who is her sister by marriage to Henry VIII. From what I remember, the entire story is told from Margaret's perspective and pretty much entirely takes place in Scotland. So it feels like the oddball book in the series because it doesn't take place in the English court. It mostly takes place in the Scottish court. So there is a little different feel to the story, and we feel a little more disconnected from the English court, which is probably on purpose because she probably felt some disconnect being so far away from them. But we also feel it as the reader because we're not as immersed in the English court as we are in the other books in the series. So then the next book chronologically would be The Other Boleyn Girl. And this one follows the perspective of Mary Boleyn, not Anne Boleyn. Mary is sister to Anne Boleyn, who would become the second wife of King Henry VIII. And she was the first one that Henry VIII had a relationship with of the 2 sisters. It does follow a slightly different perspective because it's not someone directly related to the crown, but we do get a lot of Anne's story in this book. So then next we have The Boleyn Inheritance, which follows 3 different perspectives. We get Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Jane Boleyn. Jane is cousin to Anne and Mary Boleyn. And then Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard are Henry VIII's 4th and 5th wives. We do not get a perspective in this series from Jane Seymour, who is his 3rd wife. She is covered some in both this book and The Other Boleyn Girl, but she does not have a book with her own perspective. Really, after Anne Boleyn, the marriages kind of went pretty fast, so that's why we get 2 different wives in this book. So then next we have The Taming of the Queen, which follows Henry VIII's 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr. And at that point, the series mostly wraps up King Henry VIII's wives. The next book then chronologically would be The Last Tudor. And this one follows the perspective of the 3 Grey sisters. So we have Lady Jane, who was Queen Jane Grey for a very short time. And then also her sisters, Catherine and Mary. Again, we have a lot of characters with the same name in this time. And so from their perspectives, we see Jane Grey on the throne and then the rise of Mary I to the throne, which leads into the next book, which is The Queen's Fool, which follows the perspective of a young Jewish woman who ends up getting hired on, I guess you could say, as Queen Mary's fool, or basically the court jester. This is, as far as I know, the one perspective character we have in this series who is a fictional character. She and her father have left Spain because of the Spanish Inquisition. And even though it's safer in England to be Jewish than it is to be in Spain and be Jewish, it's still not the most safe. And so she still needs to keep her religion a secret, especially as there's already religious tension between the Catholics and the Protestants at this point in time. She is working for Queen Mary, who is very much a Catholic, and has to try to go along with what Mary wants her to do as far as religion goes and keep her religion a secret. The next book in the series then would be The Virgin's Lover. And this one takes place during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And it's, again, a little bit of an oddball because it's the one primarily male perspective we get in this entire series. Most of the books, you might occasionally get a male perspective, but most of them follow just a female perspective. But this one primarily follows Robert Dudley, who is believed to have been a lover of Queen Elizabeth I. And we do also occasionally get his wife's perspective as well. So yes, there's that. But it's primarily his perspective. And then the last book in the series is The Other Queen, and this one is told from the perspective of Mary, Queen of Scots, while Elizabeth I is on the throne. And this is during a time when Mary is an exile from Scotland. She's not really being supported there, and she's seeking support from Elizabeth. Thinks she's going to get it. Doesn't really end up with what she thinks she's going to get. So that is the entire series in chronological order. Now, I did not read these books in chronological order by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm just going to, as briefly as I can, go over the books in the order that I did read them. Because again, this is going to be long enough and I still have to rank the books. So the first book that I actually read was The White Princess. And the reason this was the first one, to be perfectly honest, is because at one point when I was working, there was a day when I had a lunch break and I realized I didn't bring a book to work with me. So I went to a store, I think I went to Target, looked through their books section to see, do any books look of interest? This was the one that jumped out to me. So I bought it, I read it, I loved it. And that's why I continued on with the series. But this was already 5 books into the Cousins War series. So, at that point, to me, it only made sense to go out from this book. So, either go forward in the series or go backward in the series from this book, which is pretty much what I did. The next books that I picked up, I technically picked up 4 books at once because I read The King's Curse, and at the same time I was working through this one, I was also working on The Constant Princess, The Other Boleyn Girl, and Three Sisters, Three Queens, because all 4 of those books overlap to some degree. So I read all 4 of them at the same time, pretty much. And I jumped back and forth between books just depending on when they were taking place. So after I finished those 4, I decided to start going backwards in the series as well. So the next one that I read was The Kingmaker's Daughter. Then going forwards again, I read The Boleyn Inheritance. And then I went backwards and read The White Queen, which, again, having read them now, I would have read The Red Queen next, going backwards instead of The White Queen. But I ultimately ended up reading The White Queen instead. And sorry if the angle shifted, but the camera cut me off. So then after that, I went forward again and read The Taming of the Queen, and also read The Queen's Fool, which, like I said, is not technically chronological order, but I don't know if the order in which I read it was based on what I saw on the website, or if The Last Tudor wasn't out yet. I don't remember. But I read The Queen's Fool next. Then I went way back and read The Lady of the Rivers. And I don't know why I read that one and not the Red Queen next. Unless it was because the White Queen followed Elizabeth and the Lady of the Rivers followed her mother. Maybe that's why. I don't remember at this point. Then I went forward again and stayed going forward. So I read The Virgin's Lover, then The Last Tudor. Way out of order, but then read The Last Tudor and The Other Queen. And then finally this year went back and read The Red Queen and finally finished out the series. My reading of this series was very all over the place. And honestly, this is the one series I've read that has been even remotely out of order like this. So at this point, I'm just going to go ahead and rank the books. And as I rank them, I will talk a little bit more about how I felt about the books, why I'm giving them the ranking I am, and so on. And the ranking's going to get interesting because right now I kind of have them grouped. I know which book was my least favorite. And after that, I have groups of like, these books are on the lower end, these books were a little better, and these books were the best. And then as I go through this video, I'm going to have to figure out what order do I actually want to put the books in. So my least favorite book, this is an easy one, was The Kingmaker's Daughter. Having read, this is where I might get a little bit more spoilery. Having read The White Princess, I knew that Elizabeth, who was the wife of Henry VII, had an affair with Richard III while he was still married to Anne. We get very little information about that in The White Princess. She talks about having been in love with him, having wanted to marry him, but that's really about all we get. And so I thought with The Kingmaker's Daughter, we would get a little bit more of that story. But we really don't. It's almost barely hinted at that there was anything going on between the two of them. So I was kind of confused as to why we had this book, because we get, I guess, a little bit of inside information on what feels like more inside information on George's uprising and Richard's uprising, but I didn't feel like I learned anything in this book that I didn't already know from other books in the series. And I got a lot more information on Elizabeth's relationship with Richard from the Red Queen, and a lot more information even on the uprisings, I felt like, in the Red Queen than I did in The Kingmaker's Daughter. And even having information from someone who is closer to what's going on, because Margaret Beaufort was definitely separated from what was going on in the Red Queen, it still didn't feel like I got enough information to warrant this book being written as part of the series. So yeah, it's mostly my least favorite because I guess, really, I don't understand why it exists. Which probably sounds really mean to say, but I feel like we get the same type of information from some of the other books. So why is this one here? So, ranking the rest of the books in this series is not going to be easy. Mostly because I don't want it to sound like any of these are bad books. For the record, every book in this series, on Goodreads anyway, I gave 4 or 5 stars. The Kingmaker's Daughter, I think I probably should have actually given 3, to be honest. But the rest of the books all got 4 or 5 stars. So just know that none of these are bad books. This is purely based on which books did I enjoy the most and which books did I enjoy the least. So I think the second to last book on the list is going to be Three Sisters, Three Queens. And the main reason I didn't care for this one as much is because what I talked about, that there's a lot of disconnect from the English court because Margaret is in Scotland pretty much the entire story. So we don't feel as close to what's going on in the English court. And while it was interesting to see what was going on in Scotland at the time, which we really hadn't gotten to see up to that point, I didn't enjoy it quite as much as I did everything that was going on in England. To me, it's almost one of those of if she did another series where she wrote about some of the things going on in Scotland around the same time, and that book was considered part of it, that would be fine. That I would be interested in reading. But then I would be spending time in the same court with the same type people, the way I was with the Tudor Court series, but in Scotland. And consistently having the same people would probably make it more interesting because I would have more of an idea of who are the people we're dealing with. But This one, again, it just kind of feels like the oddball. So I did enjoy the book, but it's probably one of my lesser favorites just because it does feel so different from the rest of the series. I think the next one on my list would probably be The Last Tudor. This is the one that follows the three Grey sisters, and probably the main reason this one would be lower on the list is because we do follow three perspectives, but it's literally like part 1 we follow Jane, part 2 we follow Catherine, part 3 we follow Mary. And each time it feels like we're starting over with the story, getting to know who this person is, seeing what their life is like, because they both followed different paths and they weren't all involved with the same people or the same places all the time. It almost had the feeling of like 3 stories in one instead of just one continuous story. I think next I would probably go with The Queen's Fool. And I think a lot of this is because I wasn't the biggest fan of following Mary's court. There was a lot going on while Mary was queen, and this isn't even like from a Protestant perspective that I wasn't a fan of it. It was just there was a lot of stuff going on with her, a lot of uncertainty that she felt, and a lot of different things that just wasn't quite as interesting to read about or wasn't the most fun to read about. Not saying that like all of Henry VIII's affairs and relationships was fun to read about, just there was a lot more politics, a lot more political intrigue, and this was not quite on that same level. So I would probably put that one next. And sorry again if the camera moved, now it died. So I think the one I'm going to put next would be The White Queen. And this one, it was a good book, but it is a lot shorter than some of the other books, for starters. And I just don't feel like there was quite as much depth and detail to the story as we do get in some of the Tudor Court books. And so, unfortunately, while it was an interesting story, while I enjoyed it, there were just a lot of other books that I enjoyed more than this one. And we're really getting to the part of the list where it was a good book, but other books were better. I feel like it probably could have been longer and we probably could have gotten more information in it than we did get, but it felt a little lacking in detail compared to some of the other books. So then the next one is going to be The Other Queen. And again, this one I really enjoyed, but it's also, like Three Sisters, Three Queens, it's more detached from the English court because Mary Queen of Scots is being housed in different places around England, but she's not actually in the English court. So we're hearing about things going on. We're seeing what her life is like as she waits for Elizabeth to hopefully help her out, but we're not at all immersed in the court. However, there were a lot of things in the story I really enjoyed more than in Three Sisters, Three Queens. So even though there's the detachment, there were still enough other things going on that I still ended up really enjoying the story. All right, so now we're really getting into the middle section, which is I really enjoyed these books, but not enough to consider them my absolute favorites in the series. So it's going to get a little bit harder now. So I think the next one I'm going to put on the list is going to be The Virgin's Lover. Mostly because of the fact that it's like we're specifically following someone who is having an affair with the queen. He's already married. He refuses to leave his wife, but he's still having an affair. Again, kind of like Mary's court, Elizabeth is not the most fun to read about. No, Henry VIII isn't always the most fun to read about because he's extremely paranoid. But Elizabeth and Mary are also very paranoid about things, very unsure about things, at least as far as how it's written in this series. But Elizabeth's uncertainty really just grates on me. It's not the most fun to read about. I do really enjoy the story. I enjoy the politics, and that's really where probably some of these are going to be higher up is because of the politics. I do like political intrigue in stories, so you're going to see that a little more as we get further into the list. But I do like the political intrigue that is there. You know, there's really two sides playing against each other. It's Robert Dudley against Elizabeth's advisor. I do really enjoy the political part of it, but Elizabeth's constant uncertainty, not sure who to trust, not sure who she should listen to, plus Robert Dudley's affair, puts us a little bit lower on the list than it could have been, but it was still one that I really enjoyed. And then I think I'm going to put The Taming of the Queen next. And this one is Catherine Parr basically doing what she can, trying to figure out what she can do just in order to survive. Because obviously things have not gone well with Henry VIII's other wives. And she would like to survive this marriage. So this is kind of her figuring out, how do I fit in with this court? How do I please him enough that he doesn't turn against me? How do I keep myself free from scandal so I can survive this marriage? Because that is what happened with some of his wives, is there was scandal, and so he either divorced or beheaded them. So I really enjoyed the politics in this one, but I also enjoy just seeing Catherine figure out how to navigate all of this, because she was told she had to marry him, and so she did. Wasn't a whole lot of options there. Right. And then next, I think I'm going to go with the Boleyn inheritance. I will be honest, Catherine Howard is not the most fun person to read from, perspective-wise. She's very much a vain, very naive teenager in this book. And kind of one of those of like, you get yourself in trouble because you think you're smarter than you are. However, Anne of Cleves I really enjoyed. And I can't say I remember Jane Boleyn's perspective at this point, but I don't remember having an issue with her. Catherine Howard was the only one that I'm just like, you think you're smart, but you're really not. But again, we get a lot of political intrigue in this book because we're following 3 different perspectives and 2 of Henry VIII's wives. So it was still a really interesting book. But yeah, Catherine Howard, in some ways interesting to read from, because how much trouble does she get into because she thinks she's smarter than she is, but then also not always the most fun to read from. Then I think I'm going to go with The Constant Princess. We're definitely on the upwards at this point. I really enjoyed Catherine's perspective. Honestly, with her first marriage to Arthur, we don't really know what their marriage was like. I think there were rumors, because the way she ended up being able to marry Henry VIII was she basically told him that, I think basically like Arthur wasn't able to perform his duties as a husband or something to that effect. And so basically made it out like the marriage was never consummated, or maybe it was like on the wedding night, but that was it at most. But I think it was just more so that it was never consummated at all. So that's how she was able to go ahead and marry Henry VIII. But Philippa Gregory takes the position in the story because it was a question. Did she and Arthur actually have a normal marriage? You know, was the marriage consummated? Was it legal? Or was it not? You know, did she lie? Did she tell the truth? And Philippa Gregory runs with the she lied aspect, which is altogether possible, but we don't know. And shows what maybe their marriage could have been like if it had been a true marriage and a happy marriage, and then has her married to Henry VIII. So I did enjoy seeing the 2 different marriages, how she kind of navigates things politically. Then next, I think I'm going to go with The Red Queen. And this is an interesting book to read. I really enjoyed all of the political stuff we got to see, all the stuff we got to hear about. I will be honest, Margaret Beaufort is not the best character's perspective to read from, because she is very vain. She is very full of herself. But I did enjoy all of the other information that we got in the book, all the other people we got to see that we normally don't get to see much of. So I really enjoyed that part of it. And then the next one before I get into my top 3 is going to be The Lady of the Rivers. And this one, we follow Jacquetta in 2 different marriages. And she spends part of her time in France, then part of her time in England. And there's just a lot of things that we get to see from her perspective that are really interesting. I love the part in France. We really don't get to see any of the happenings in France. Again, it's France today. At the time, it was a territory of England, but it's in France today. And it's really a part that we don't get to see much of in this series. So I really enjoy getting to see all of that. But then we do come back to England and we get that, you know, closer proximity to the English throne that we get in most of the books in the series. All right, so we are now up to my top 3. So all of these books I loved. The first one I'm going to mention, I'm actually tempted to reread now that I've finished the series. But all 3 of these I loved. I have to pick an order, so this is the order I'm going with. The next one is going to be The White Princess. It's the first book that I read, and yes, it's number 3 on the list. I absolutely loved this book. I fell in love with this as soon as I read it and immediately wanted to continue with the series. Thankfully, a lot of the books in the series have measured up to it. But this one, we follow Elizabeth through the beginnings of her marriage to Henry VII, through a lot of the later years. We don't get to the point of seeing Catherine of Aragon, as far as I recall. So we don't get to the point of any of her kids getting married or anything like that. But we do follow her through her life, through most of her kids growing up. And we still see this tension between the Yorks and the Lancasters. Even though York and Lancaster have now married, Henry VII still is concerned about the Yorks and the Plantagenets, and so we see a lot of that tension in this book. Also, we very prominently have Margaret Beaufort from the Red Queen, and she is the mother-in-law you do not want to have. So a lot of politics going on in this book, and I absolutely loved it. I'm going to put the coffee down for this one. So number 2 on my list is going to be The Other Boleyn Girl. And yes, it's a beastie book. I fully understand why this is probably the best-selling book in the series. With Mary Boleyn's perspective, we see as Henry VIII's court is changing. He's been married to Catherine of Aragon for a while. Then he starts having affairs with other women in court. We see the change as he starts questioning his marriage with Catherine. We see a lot of the paranoia he has, which he probably inherited from his father, only his is a whole lot worse. Again, we see a lot of the political stuff going on because Mary is a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. So we get a lot of the politics of what's going on, and even after Henry loses interest in Mary and starts pursuing her sister instead, we still continue to see a lot of what's happening with Anne. We get a lot more information about court politics. Sorry if you can hear the train, but I gotta get this recorded. But we get a lot of the court politics from Anne's perspective that she shares with Mary. We have a good portion, if not the entirety, of Anne's marriage to King Henry VIII as well. So yeah, there is so much covered in this book, and it is so well written. Very much one of my favorite books in the series. So then, if you've kept track of which books I've mentioned and which one I haven't, means you know which book I'm going to talk about next. But my favorite book in the series is The King's Curse. And this book I loved cover to cover. Margaret Pole sees so much in the 40 years that this book covers. Again, this one is actually a little bit more detached because Margaret Pole is not in the court, but the things that are happening in court, she very much hears about from people she knows there. And then also, the things that are happening at court affect her because she is a Plantagenet. She is one of the people that Henry VIII is so concerned about. So we really get to see all of the political implications, the things that are happening because of decisions that Henry VIII has made on the people outside of the court through what happens in her life. And I just absolutely loved this book. I mean, at times it feels like a toss-up between this one and The Other Boleyn Girl as to which is my favorite. But based on how I felt at the time that I finished it, this one was just a little bit better. All right, I think that's everything I wanted to go over in this video for the most part. I will let you know up front in case you're worried about content, because when I read these books, I was not posting content in my Goodreads reviews. So you won't find any of that online. And at this point, I'm going to have to remember about 10 years worth of content. So in general, I will say language-wise, there usually is some in the books, but not a ton of it. And a lot of the books do have some open door scenes. Now, I have read some books that are very graphic when it comes to sex scenes, at least in my opinion. Philippa Gregory's books are usually not on that level. The two that I would say come the closest to being on that level, and even still, I don't think she's as graphic as a lot of writers can be, but probably mostly in like the number of open door scenes. The two worst ones would be The Virgin's Lover and The Constant Princess. But most of the books do have at least one or two open door scenes. I don't think The Other Queen does. simply because I don't recall any like romantic relationships in the book where that would even potentially come up. But I think all of the other books do. It's possible there's another one that doesn't, but most of the books have at least one or two scenes. But I will say, obviously, if you have issues with open door scenes, then just know that before you decide to pick up these books. You may not want to. But I will just say, for anyone who's curious, I do typically feel like when she has open door scenes, there's a purpose behind them. And there's a lot of books that I hear about, or even a few that I have read, where I feel like the open door scene is just there because they wanted an open door scene. I don't feel like it was actually serving a purpose. It's just there to be there. And for people who want to read open door scenes, they probably don't care. They're fine with it being there. But for me, I don't like to read open door scenes. So if it's going to be in a book, there needs to be a reason behind it. And I usually feel like with her books, I would say 9 times out of 10 minimum, I feel like there is a purpose behind the open door scenes. There's something in the relationship that we are learning about. And again, for most of her books, not all of them, but for most of her books, they're not over the top graphic. There are times I feel like she gives a little bit more information than we really need, but I feel like a lot of it is just giving an idea, because you could see the characters interacting and say, okay, they have this kind of relationship. But then once she shows this is what they're like behind closed doors, it gives you more information about what their relationship is like. Do they actually get along? Is the husband just overbearing and, will have his way and then moves on? Are they actually tender towards each other? Do they actually care about each other? So I feel like there are things you learn about them as a couple from her exploring the behind the doors, what people don't see in public, that you don't get otherwise. So I do at least feel like most of the time there is a purpose to them. Doesn't mean I enjoy reading them. Doesn't mean I don't sometimes skip over most, if not all of the scene. But these are at least books where I feel like them being there at least does serve a purpose to the story, even if I don't prefer to read them. And then there is violence in the books. There's a lot. This is politics in the late 1400s, early 1500s. There's a lot of people who die because they were on the wrong side. There's wars, there's battles, there's uprisings, there's politics where people are sentenced to death for various crimes. They might be legit crimes, they might really not seem like legit crimes. For the most part, as far as blood and gore, they're not usually overly graphic. And a lot of them are, we hear about this person dying, but we don't see it on page. So there is a lot of violence. A lot of it doesn't happen on page. The ones that do, not overly graphic and gory. Occasionally they can be, but most of the time not. But that's the kind of content I can remember being in these books. So use that to decide if this is a series you want to pick up or not, along with whatever else I've talked about. I think that is it. I think I've talked long enough. My throat is getting dry. That's all I have for you guys for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've read any of the books in this series, let me know which ones you liked, and also any that you didn't care for and why. I know we all have differing opinions, so I'm curious to hear what you thought about some of these books if you've read the series. Other than that, I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you later.